work as a night security guard at an office building in the heart of the city. During the day, it's a bustling place, but at night, it transforms into an eerie, almost unsettling silence. The building is old, with long hallways and dim lighting that makes shadows dance on the walls when you least expect it. I've worked here for a few years now, and I've grown used to the routine, patrolling the premises, checking the cameras, and making sure everything is secure. Normally I have a partner with me, but this month I'm alone. The company is training a new employee, and I've been left to hold down the fort until they're ready. At first, I didn't mind. Being alone is more boring, but it's also quieter. Without anyone to talk to, time drags on and the monotony can be draining. Still, I preferred it over dealing with an annoying coworker. At least that's what I thought. It all started about 2 weeks ago. I was doing my usual patrol, walking through the empty parking lot, when I noticed 2 men standing across the street. They were far away, almost at the edge of my vision, but I could see them there, motionless in the dark. I couldn't tell if they were looking at the building or at me. The feeling was instant, a chill down my spine, that kind of discomfort you can't ignore. I stood there for a few seconds, watching, but they didn't move. I decided to continue my rounds, trying not to think too much about it. The next time I passed by, the men were gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that strange feeling lingered. I made a mental note of it, but didn't give it much thought. After all, the city center is full of strange people, and I've seen it all before. The rest of the night was uneventful, and I left at 6 a.m. without any further incidents. But deep down, that image of the 2 men standing in the dark stayed with me. Something about that scene wasn't right, and I knew that night was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that seeing those 2 men was just a coincidence. Maybe they were waiting for someone, or maybe they were just passing by. But deep down, I knew something was off. Then one night toward the end of the week, they reappeared. I was doing my usual external patrol when I saw them again. This time, there was no doubt. They were in the same spot, standing in the dark, just like before. Their posture was the same, motionless, as if they were waiting for something or someone. My heart raced, and that sense of discomfort came rushing back. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, that I was just tired from the night shift, but I couldn't shake it. Something about that scene deeply unsettled me. I decided not to ignore it this time. Instead of continuing my patrol, I stayed outside the building watching them. Maybe if they saw that I'd noticed them, they'd leave. I stood there, pacing back and forth, trying to look busy but keeping an eye on them the whole time. My hand hovered near my radio, ready to call for backup if needed. 5 minutes passed, and then slowly the men walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away. I tried to memorize their features: dark clothes, stiff posture, calculated movements. But from that distance, there wasn't much I could make out. They seemed like ghosts, shadowy figures that appeared and vanished without a trace. After they left, I stayed outside for another 15 minutes, making sure they didn't come back. The silence of the night, which had once been comforting, now felt heavy, as if the air itself was charged with a threatening energy. When I finally went back inside, I felt a temporary sense of relief, but I knew the night wasn't over. Something was about to happen, and I had no idea how close the danger really was. After the men disappeared that night, I tried to go about my routine as if nothing had happened. I went back inside the building, checked the cameras, and sat in the security office for a while. Everything seemed normal, but that nagging feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I decided it was best to do another patrol, just to be sure. As I walked down the internal hallway, the silence was almost oppressive. The building at night has a different sound: the hum of the lights, the echo of my footsteps on the concrete floor. It was a sound I was used to, but that night it seemed louder, more menacing. I reached the break room, which was at the end of the hallway, and decided to take a break. I sat at the table, grabbed my lunch, and started eating, trying to distract myself with my phone. That's when I heard it, a noise, low but distinct. It came from the hallway outside. It sounded metallic, like someone had hit a metal surface. My body froze for a moment, and I dropped my fork onto the plate. The sound wasn't familiar. It wasn't the coffee machine or a fan. It was something I'd never heard before. I set my phone down and listened intently. The hallway was dark, except for the faint light coming from the break room. I stood up slowly, trying not to make noise, and walked to the door. I stood there for a good 30 seconds waiting to hear something else, but the silence returned, heavy and absolute. It must have been nothing, I thought, trying to convince myself. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was a noise from outside. But deep down I knew it wasn't just that. Something was wrong. I went back to the table and finished my lunch, but the food tasted bland. My ears were still alert, waiting to hear anything. When I was done, I decided to do another patrol, this time more alert than ever. I grabbed my flashlight and left the office, walking down the hallway toward the emergency exit. That's when I saw it. The emergency exit, that old heavy metal door that led to the stairwell, was open. The large padlock that kept it secured was broken in half, lying on the floor. The door had been forced open and the marks of violence were clear, deep scratches in the metal as if someone had used a tool to break in. My heart raced. Someone had gotten into the building, and worse, I hadn't heard anything except that metallic noise. I tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt thin. I looked down both ends of the hallway, expecting to see someone, but it was empty. The silence was deafening. I ran back to the security office, my hands shaking as I tried to check the cameras. I needed to figure out what was going on, but deep down, I already knew. This night wasn't going to be like the others. Someone was inside the building with me, and I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I ran back to the security office, my hands trembling as I tried to pull up the camera feeds. The images appeared on the screen, and I started scrolling through the different views of the building. At first, everything seemed normal. The empty hallways, the quiet parking lot. But then, when I got to the camera covering the emergency exit area, my stomach dropped. The two men I'd seen outside were inside the building. They were in the hallway, not far from the break room where I'd been just minutes earlier. One of them was standing near a door, as if waiting for something, while the other moved slowly, looking around. They were dressed in black with hoods covering their faces, and I could see something glinting on their belts, knives or maybe even guns. My body went cold. I had walked past that hallway. I had been just a few feet away from them, completely unaware. The break room door was slightly ajar, and I wondered if one of them had seen me inside. The thought that they could have been watching me while I ate without me noticing made me feel sick. The camera footage showed that they had entered through the broken emergency exit while I was in the break room. I had heard that metallic noise, probably one of them bumping into something as they tried to hide. They had been inside the building longer than I'd realized, and I hadn't noticed. My mind raced. What did they want? To steal something? Or something worse? They were armed and I was alone. I tried to calm myself, to take deep breaths, but the fear was overwhelming. I reached for my radio but hesitated. If I made a call, they might hear me. I didn't know where they were now or if they were still in the hallway. I decided to check the cameras again, trying to track their movements. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the men was standing on the other side of a door, literally just a few feet from where I had walked minutes earlier. He was motionless, as if waiting for someone, waiting for me. My whole body was shaking. They were prepared. They knew I was here. And worse, they had weapons. That glint on their belts wasn't just a knife. On the footage, it was clear that at least one of them was carrying what looked like a small firearm. They weren't here for a simple robbery. They were ready to take down anyone in their way, including me. A wave of panic washed over me. I needed to call the police, but at the same time, I couldn't make noise. They were too close. If I made the wrong move, they could find me, and with those weapons, I wouldn't stand a chance. That's when I heard another noise. This time, it came from the hallway near the security office. Someone was approaching. My heart stopped. They were coming for me. The noise in the hallway stopped abruptly, but I knew I wasn't alone. My fingers trembled as I held the radio, hesitating to make the call. If they heard me, it would be over. I looked at the cameras again, trying to locate the men, but the images were static, showing only empty hallways. They were somewhere between me and the cameras, and I had no way of knowing exactly where. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my phone and quietly dialed 911, whispering the address and the situation. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, but promised to send a unit. I hung up and hid behind the security desk, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. I didn't have any way to defend myself, but I wasn't going to just sit there and wait for them to find me. Minutes dragged by, each second feeling like an eternity. The silence was almost unbearable and I could barely breathe. That's when I heard footsteps. They were coming toward me slowly, as if they knew exactly where I was. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid they could hear it. The security office door was slightly ajar, and I could see a shadow moving outside. Suddenly, the sound of distant sirens echoed from outside the building. The footsteps stopped and the shadow disappeared. I heard muffled voices followed by the sound of running. They were fleeing. The police had arrived just in time. When the officers entered the building, I was shaking, sitting on the floor of the security office. They searched the area, but the men were already gone. The only thing they found was the broken emergency exit and the shattered padlock on the ground. The cameras hadn't captured their faces. They were always hooded, and the footage was grainy. The company was notified, and the next day technicians came to reinforce the building's security. But for me, the damage was already done. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my routine, but something had changed. The building, which had once just been my workplace, now felt haunted. Every sound, every shadow, made me look over my shoulder. The company claimed that some hard drives and important files had been stolen, but they never figured out exactly what the men had taken, or why. To this day, there are no answers. The men were never caught, and the police closed the case due to lack of evidence, but I know they were prepared for something bigger. The weapons, the way they moved through the building, the way they seemed to know exactly where the cameras were, it all makes me think that night could have ended much worse. Now every time I do my rounds, I feel like someone's watching me. The dark hallway, the emergency exit, the oppressive silence, it all reminds me of that night. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the security office, I swear I hear footsteps in the hallway. But when I go to check, there's no one there. The night that never ended still haunts my shifts, and I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. The men may be gone, but the fear they left behind is still here, alive, like a shadow that never fades. I work the night shift at a hospital, specifically in the emergency room. As a receptionist, my job is to check patients in, but even so, I end up seeing a lot of crazy things. Every night is unpredictable, but that night started off quiet. A few people came and went, but nothing out of the ordinary. I was sitting at my desk, chatting with my coworker Emily, trying to pass the time. Around 2 a.m., Emily left for a break in the cafeteria, and I was alone at the front desk. That's when he showed up. A man walked through the front doors wearing a black hoodie with a zipper and dark jeans. His hair was dark and a bit messy, like he hadn't showered in days. He approached the counter slowly, and there was something about his presence that made me uneasy. "I'm looking for Hannah Smith," he said in a low, raspy voice. The name didn't ring a bell, and as far as I knew, we hadn't admitted anyone by that name recently. Still, I checked the records, but there was nothing. When I told him there was no one here by that name, he just nodded, as if processing the information, and left without another word. I glanced at the security guard across the room, and we exchanged looks. That guy was weird, and we both knew it. Half an hour later, Emily came back, and the rest of the shift was uneventful. I left at 4 a.m., said goodbye to my coworkers, and headed to the parking lot. The hospital parking lot was massive, and all employees had to park in the back to leave the closer spots for patients. As I walked to my car, a strange feeling came over me. The parking lot was eerily quiet, and I found myself thinking about that man again. I don't know why, but suddenly I felt uneasy. I walked a little faster, reached my car, and got in quickly. I drove home, but the feeling of being followed didn't go away. The roads were empty, and every time I checked the rearview mirror, there was no one behind me. Still, that feeling lingered. When I got home, I pulled into the garage and parked. I had barely taken off my shoes when I heard footsteps running toward my porch. They reached the door and immediately tried to open it, rattling the handle forcefully. Thankfully, I always lock the door instinctively. There was a pause, and then a familiar voice spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am, can you open the door? I need help." It was him, the same man from the hospital. My heart raced, and I grabbed my phone to call the police. Seconds later, he took off running. I looked through the peephole and watched him disappear into the darkness. When the police arrived, I was shocked to discover that the back door of my car was open. He had been in the back seat the entire time, which explained how he got to my front door so quickly. Even more disturbing was the fact that he probably expected me to park in the driveway, which would have given him direct access to my house. That night, parking in the garage likely saved my life. The police used the hospital's security footage to identify the man. He was arrested a few days later, but he never admitted to anything. He was a complete stranger, but he had been fixated on me, stalking me for weeks. I never found out what he wanted, and since then I haven't heard anything more about him. But to this day, every time I get into my car, I check the back seat. When I was in my early 20s, I worked the night shift at a convenience store. I was still taking online college classes at the time, and the nights at the store were usually quiet enough for me to study during my shift. Most of the time, I was the only employee there, and we rarely got busy. Whenever someone came in, I would just push my laptop aside and assist them. When they left, I went back to studying. That night, it was cold and rainy outside, which always made me happy, because it meant almost no customers would come in. I had my laptop open and had been focused on schoolwork for nearly 2 hours straight, when the front door opened and a man walked in. He looked to be in his 30s with a beard and short hair. I set my laptop aside and waited for him to approach the counter, but he just glanced around the aisles for a minute or two and then left, getting into a car and driving away. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just went back to my work. About 30 minutes later, I saw headlights pulling up in front of the store. I looked up, confused, to see the same car from earlier. Maybe it was just a coincidence, I thought. But when the man got out, it was the same guy. This time, he walked straight into the store and came right up to the counter. Before I could move my laptop, he asked, "Where's the restroom?" I pointed toward the bathroom, and he walked over. It was a single-person restroom, not a large one. I found it odd that he had come back 30 minutes later just to use the bathroom. It didn't make sense unless he had been hanging around the area the whole time. I waited a few minutes, but he didn't come out. I started feeling uneasy. I didn't want to be that guy who knocks on the door. But after 15 minutes, he had already been in there for almost 25 minutes. That's when a police officer walked into the store. He looked concerned and asked if I knew who owned the car parked outside. I pointed to the bathroom and told him the man had been in there for a while. The officer walked over and started knocking on the door, yelling for the man to come out. After a minute, he turned to me and asked if I had a key to the door. My hands were shaking, but I found the key in the drawer beneath the counter and handed it to him. The officer unlocked the door and swung it open, gun raised. The bathroom was empty. I couldn't believe it. The officer did a more thorough search and realized that the ceiling was accessible. It was one of those made of panels you can push up. He called for backup, and within 15 minutes, they found the man hiding in the ceiling. I later found out that the guy was on the run after committing horrible crimes against multiple innocent people that night. The police had a description of his car and got his license plate from a security camera. They told me I was lucky because the other victims had been completely alone in the middle of the night, either working or just walking around. I don't know if the man was trying to hide in the ceiling because he knew the police were after him, or if he had other intentions with me. What I do know is that, thank God he's in jail now, but to this day, every time I work a night shift, I keep an eye on the ceiling.